You're sitting on the edge of your bed at 3 in the morning, looking at your own hands as if they belong to a stranger, and a terrifying question echoes in your mind. Have I gone insane? The world around you seems to have changed shape. People speak a language you no longer understand. The rules of life's game have been altered without anyone warning you, and you feel like an actor who forgot their lines in the middle of a play where everyone else seems to know exactly what to do. You walk through the streets and observe crowds rushing to places that make no sense, fulfilling empty rituals, chasing goals that seem absurd, and a growing sensation of isolation takes hold of your chest. Perhaps you've started questioning things you once accepted without thinking. Why do we work so hard to buy things we don't need? Why do we pretend to be fine when we're shattered inside? Why do we follow patterns that make us unhappy just to be accepted by a society that seems to have completely lost its way? And then the deepest fear of all emerges. Is the problem me? Has my mind finally given in under the weight of a reality that has become unbearable? But what if I told you that this sensation of estrangement, this perception that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, is not a sign of madness, but rather the first symptom of a profound and necessary awakening? What if I told you that you haven't gone insane, but have simply woken up in a world that long ago lost its sanity, and that this discovery, as painful as it may be, is the first step toward a transformation that can completely change your life? If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes this sensation of estrangement, this acute perception that there exists an unbridgeable distance between who you really are and the world that surrounds you. This channel is a safe space for those who, like you, can no longer pretend that everything is fine, for those who feel they've awakened in a reality where the rules don't make sense and people seem to live on autopilot. Here, we explore these deep questions that most people avoid confronting directly. We offer perspectives that can help you understand that your sensitivity is not a weakness, but rather a strength that can guide you toward a more authentic and meaningful life. Subscribe to the channel because you don't need to go through this journey alone, because there are other people like you, questioning, seeking, trying to find meaning in an existence that often seems devoid of purpose. Leave a like if this content resonates with something inside you, if you feel you've finally found words to describe sensations that have long inhabited your chest. Together, we can explore these deep existential questions and discover that what many call madness might actually be the beginning of wisdom. Franz Kafka, in his disturbing genius, captured like few others the sensation of being a foreigner in your own life, of waking up one day and discovering that the world around you has transformed into an incomprehensible machine where you can no longer find your place. His stories speak of men who wake up transformed into insects, of people who are judged for crimes they never committed, of individuals trapped in labyrinthine bureaucracies where rules constantly change without explanation. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about Kafka's works is not the absurdity of the situations he describes, but rather how much they resemble the reality we live every day. How many times have you not felt like Joseph K. in the trial, being judged by standards you don't understand, by people who seem to know something you completely ignore? How many times have you not experienced the same sensation as Gregor Samsa in The Metamorphosis, waking up in a body and a life you no longer recognize as your own? Observing people around you continue their routines as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Kafka's genius lay in understanding that madness doesn't necessarily reside in the individual's mind, but rather in the structure of a world that has completely lost the capacity to offer genuine meaning to human existence. We live in a society where people wake up every day to work jobs they hate, to buy products they don't need, to maintain relationships that drain them. And when someone questions this absurd logic, they are immediately labeled as problematic, maladjusted, or worse still, as mentally unstable. But what if the true madness were exactly the opposite? What if madness lay in passively accepting an existence that systematically denies everything that makes life worth living: creativity, authenticity, genuine love, the search for purpose, real connection with other human beings? When you feel this strange sensation of displacement, as if you were an actor playing a role you didn't choose in a play you don't understand, you are experiencing what existentialist philosophers call alienation. But alienation from what exactly? You are alienating yourself from a system that demands you sacrifice your essential humanity in exchange for social approval that, in the end, proves to be completely empty. You are distancing yourself from a structure that promises happiness through consumption, success through competition, and fulfillment through conformity, but in practice delivers only anxiety, depression, and a growing sensation of inner emptiness. And have you felt this disturbing sensation of being a foreigner in your own life, of looking around and no longer recognizing the world that once seemed familiar? Have you experienced that moment when you stop in the middle of a daily activity and wonder how you got there, as if your life had been lived by someone else while you just observed? If you're going through this now, if you feel you've awakened in a reality that no longer makes sense, leave in the comments, "I woke up too." Your courage in sharing this experience might be exactly what another person needs to hear today, the confirmation that they are not alone in this journey of questioning and discovery. The transformation that Kafka describes in his works is not a sudden and dramatic change, but rather a gradual and often imperceptible process where you begin to perceive the fundamental contradictions of modern existence. You begin to notice how people around you live fragmented lives, divided between who they are at home, at work, on social media, as if they were multiple different people inhabiting the same body. You observe how everyone seems to be constantly running toward goals that, when finally achieved, prove to be surprisingly empty and unsatisfying. You perceive how modern society has created a system where a person's value is measured by their capacity to produce and consume, reducing the infinite richness of human experience to simple numbers on a spreadsheet. This growing perception of alienation can be terrifying, because it shatters the comfortable illusions that allowed us to function on autopilot. Suddenly, you can no longer accept simple answers to complex questions. You can no longer pretend that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. You can no longer participate in superficial conversations about subjects that don't matter, while fundamental questions about the meaning of life remain completely ignored. It's as if you had taken a pill that removes a filter you didn't even know existed, and now you see reality with a clarity that is simultaneously liberating and frightening. But here is the crucial point that Kafka understood with a wisdom that transcends his time. This sensation of estrangement is not a disease to be cured, but rather a symptom of mental health in a sick society. When you feel displaced in a world that has completely lost its way, this doesn't mean you're losing your sanity, but rather that your sanity is finally manifesting. You are reacting naturally and appropriately to a situation that is genuinely absurd and unsustainable. The problem is not that you have awakened. The problem is that most people are still sleeping. Think of a simple analogy. Imagine you're in a theater watching a play, and suddenly you realize that all the actors have forgotten their lines, that the scenery is falling apart, that the director has disappeared. But even so, the audience continues applauding politely and pretending that everything is proceeding perfectly. Would you be considered crazy for pointing out that the play has completely lost its meaning, or would it be crazy to continue applauding something that clearly doesn't work? This is essentially the situation we find ourselves in. We live in a society where pointing out obvious contradictions is considered a sign of instability, while passively accepting the absurd is seen as a sign of maturity and adaptation. Kafka's work shows us that there is a fundamental difference between being crazy and being awake in a crazy world. When Gregor Samsa wakes up transformed into a giant insect, his family is not concerned with the extraordinary fact of the metamorphosis itself, but rather with the practical inconveniences this transformation causes to their routines. They are more worried about the fact that Gregor can no longer go to work than with the profound mystery of his transformation. This is a perfect metaphor for how modern society treats deep existential questions, completely ignoring them while concentrating on superficial and immediate concerns. When you begin to question the fundamental structures of modern life, when you refuse to accept that happiness can be bought, that success can only be measured in material terms, that relationships can be reduced to transactions, you are doing something that requires immense courage. You are choosing to live consciously in an era of generalized unconsciousness, choosing to think critically in a time when critical thinking is discouraged in favor of conformity and consumption. This choice inevitably leads to isolation, because you can no longer participate in the collective illusions that keep most people functioning on autopilot. But this isolation, as painful as it may be, also opens space for a much deeper and more authentic connection with life. When you stop trying to fit into molds that were created to suppress your individuality, when you stop seeking approval in systems that are fundamentally hostile to your essential humanity, you create space to discover who you really are beneath all the social masks you were forced to wear. It's a process that Kafka described masterfully, the painful but necessary deconstruction of a false identity to allow the birth of a more authentic version of yourself. This awakening journey is neither linear nor predictable. There are days when you feel completely lost, as if you had awakened on an alien planet where you cannot decipher any of the social codes. There are moments when you question your own sanity, especially when everyone around you seems perfectly comfortable with situations that to you seem completely absurd. There are periods when loneliness becomes almost unbearable, when you feel like the only conscious being in a crowd of sleepwalkers. But there are also moments of extraordinary clarity when you realize that your sensitivity is not a weakness, but rather a fine antenna capable of capturing truths that remain invisible to those who are completely anesthetized by routine and social convention. What Kafka teaches us is that true transformation always begins with a feeling of estrangement, with the perception that something is fundamentally wrong with the status quo. Gregor Samsa did not choose to transform into an insect, but once transformed, he had to learn to navigate a completely new reality. Similarly, when you awaken to the contradictions of modern existence, when you begin to see through the illusions that keep most people trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction and emptiness, you cannot simply return to the previous state of unconsciousness. You have been forced to embark on a journey you did not choose, but one that can lead to extraordinary discoveries about the nature of reality and about your own potential as a human being. The key to navigating this transformation is understanding that you are not alone in this experience. Throughout history, there have always been people who refused to accept official versions of reality, who questioned apparently solid structures, who dared to point out that the emperor was naked, even when this meant being ostracized or ridiculed. Kafka was one of these people, and through his art, he created a map for those who find themselves lost in the labyrinth of modern existence. His stories don't offer easy answers or quick solutions, but they offer something much more valuable: confirmation that your experience of alienation is valid and shared by other sensitive and conscious human beings. Modern society has an impressive capacity to pathologize any behavior that doesn't fit perfectly into its pre-established molds. If you are too sensitive, they say you have anxiety. If you question too much, they say you are negative. If you refuse to participate in empty social rituals, they say you are antisocial. If you cannot fake enthusiasm for goals you consider futile, they say you are depressed. But what if all these characteristics were signs of mental health in a society that has completely lost contact with fundamental human values? What if your inability to adapt to destructive structures were actually a sign that your essential humanity remains intact? Kafka understood that living consciously in an unconscious world is inevitably a Kafkaesque experience. You find yourself trapped in systems you don't understand, judged by criteria you don't accept, forced to participate in games whose rules constantly change without explanation. But at the same time, this experience of alienation can become a source of extraordinary strength. When you stop trying to fit into external expectations and begin to live according to your own internal values, when you stop seeking validation from external sources and begin to cultivate a deeper relationship with yourself, when you stop trying to control external variables and begin to focus on the only territory that is truly under your control, your own consciousness and your own choices, you discover a form of freedom that no external structure can take from you. This internal freedom doesn't mean you become immune to the difficulties of modern life, nor that you develop a magical capacity to transform external structures that are beyond your individual control. It means you develop the capacity to maintain your personal integrity even when navigating hostile or absurd environments. It means you learn to distinguish between what is genuinely your problem and what is a problem of the system you are inserted in. It means you stop internalizing criticism that comes from sources that have neither moral authority nor wisdom to judge you. Franz Kafka lived in an era of profound social transformations. When traditional structures were crumbling and new forms of social organization were emerging, he perceived that these changes, while necessary, were creating new types of alienation and new types of psychological suffering. People were losing connections with traditional communities, with systems of meaning that had functioned for generations, with forms of identity that, despite being limited, offered at least some sense of belonging and purpose. In exchange, they were gaining individual freedoms, economic opportunities, and possibilities of social mobility, but they were also facing unprecedented levels of loneliness, anxiety, and existential confusion. We live in an era that amplifies all these challenges. Modern technology connects us instantly with people from around the world, but paradoxically leaves us more isolated than ever. We have access to enormous quantities of information, but feel less capable of discerning between truth and lies. We have more formal freedoms than any previous generation, but feel more trapped in systems that seem beyond our control. We have more options for entertainment, consumption, and experiences than any society in history, but growing rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide indicate that something fundamental is missing from our lives. When you feel you have gone insane, when the world around you seems to have completely lost meaning, you might be experiencing a form of spiritual awakening that is both an end and a beginning. It is the end of illusions you carried about how life should function, about how people should behave, about how society should be organized. But it is also the beginning of a more mature and realistic relationship with existence, one that accepts contradictions without trying to resolve them artificially, one that finds meaning in the search itself rather than waiting for definitive answers that may never come. True sanity in an era like ours might consist in the capacity to maintain hope without denying reality, to continue loving without becoming naive, to continue seeking meaning without despairing when that meaning doesn't reveal itself immediately. Kafka shows us that it is possible to live with dignity even in absurd circumstances, that it is possible to maintain humanity even when surrounded by inhuman structures, that it is possible to find beauty and meaning even in the most Kafkaesque situations of modern existence. Perhaps you haven't gone insane. Perhaps you have simply awakened in a world that desperately needs more awakened people. People willing to question, to feel deeply, and to live with authenticity, even when this means walking alone through unexplored territories of human experience.